There is a type of daughter narcissistic mothers fear. Not dislike, fear. And the reason has very little to do with rebellion or disrespect. It has everything to do with clarity. Because narcissistic family systems survive through confusion, through silence, through roles that everyone unconsciously agrees to play. The golden child, the scapegoat, the peacemaker, the invisible one. Each role keeps the emotional system intact. Each role helps maintain the illusion that the mother's version of reality is the only reality. But every once in a while, a daughter emerges who begins noticing the pattern and refuses to participate. She clearly sees the manipulation. She recognizes the emotional games. She senses the distortions between what is happening and how it's being explained. And that awareness threatens everything. Because narcissistic mothers do not simply want admiration. They want control over the narrative. They need to define what is true, even if it's completely false. They need to tell you what happened, who is to blame, who is good, who is difficult, who is too sensitive, who is the problem. As long as the narcissistic parent can control the narrative, the system stays stable for them. But the daughter who sees clearly disrupts that so-called stability. She notices contradictions. She asks questions. She remembers what actually happened and what was truly said. And perhaps most dangerous of all, she refuses to abandon her own perception just to keep the peace. That kind of daughter becomes very difficult for the narcissistic parent to manage, not because she's aggressive, not because she is cruel, but because she is aware. And narcissistic families rely on people remaining unaware or asleep to the patterns. Often, this daughter was labeled the most difficult growing up, the dramatic one, the overly emotional one, the one who has always caused problems. But what was actually happening was something very, very different. She was noticing things other people were trained not to see. She was reacting to emotional injuries that others had normalized. She was speaking out against the constant bullying and threats that she received from the narcissistic parent. She was asking questions the family system could not afford to answer. And when that happens, the narcissistic mother often escalates. More criticism, more humiliation disguised as jokes, more triangulation, more attempts to turn siblings or other family members against her. Because one of the most powerful tools narcissistic systems use is isolation. If the daughter who sees clearly can be portrayed as unstable or dramatic, the rest of the family does not have to confront the uncomfortable truth she is pointing toward. But something interesting happens with daughters like this. The more they are blamed, the more they begin investigating their own experience. They begin asking deeper questions. They begin asking the questions that the other family members are unwilling to ask or face. Why do I feel anxious around my own mother? Why do I feel like she's trying to sabotage me? Why do conversations with her always leave me feeling confused or invalidated? Why do I feel guilty even when I haven't done anything wrong? Why does the story of what happened always seem to change when she's telling my stepdad? These questions are the beginning of awakening. And awakening inside a narcissistic family system is incredibly disruptive. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You begin recognizing gaslighting in real time. You notice when conversations suddenly shift to make you the problem. You observe how accountability never seems to exist in one direction. And eventually, something inside the daughter changes. She stops trying to convince her mother to understand her. She stops asking herself, why does my mother hate me? She stops trying to prove her innocence. She stops chasing approval that was always conditional. Instead, she begins protecting her perception. And that moment is terrifying for narcissistic mothers. Because the daughter who no longer doubts herself is no longer easy to manipulate and control. The daughter who trusts her memory cannot be easily gaslit. The daughter who sees triangulation refuses to participate in it. The daughter who recognizes manipulation stops rewarding it. In other words, the system begins losing its grip. But here is something important to understand. The daughter narcissistic mothers fear the most is not the loudest daughter. She is not necessarily the most confrontational. Often, she becomes something far more threatening. Calm, grounded, clear. She no longer argues endlessly trying to prove her point. She simply recognizes what is happening. She sets boundaries. She disengages from the manipulation. She refuses to collapse into guilt when guilt is being manufactured. And that quiet clarity destabilizes the entire dynamic. Because narcissistic control depends on emotional reactivity. If the daughter reacts with intense anger at the mother, She can be labeled as unstable. If the daughter reacts with tears, the mother can label her overly emotional. But if the daughter responds with calm, clarity, and firm boundaries, the manipulation loses its power. And often this is when the narcissistic mother begins portraying the daughter as cold, cruel, unstable, ungrateful, something to that effect. Because the daughter has stopped performing the emotional role that once stabilized the system. She no longer will participate in that toxic system. But here's the truth many daughters eventually discover. The narcissistic mother never feared the daughter's anger. She feared the daughter's awareness. Because awareness dismantles the illusion. And when the illusion collapses, the mother can no longer control how the story is told. For many daughters, reaching this level of clarity is a long journey. It requires grief, grieving the mother they hoped would change, grieving the family dynamic they wished could become healthier, grieving the years spent trying to earn love that should have been freely given. But on the other side of that grief, something extraordinary happens. The daughter stops orienting her life around her mother's reactions. She begins building a life that exists outside the narcissistic system. She creates relationships where love does not require self-abandonment. She trusts her perception. She honors her instincts. She no longer feels responsible for managing someone else's volatility. And that is the moment the daughter becomes something incredibly powerful. Not the scapegoat, not anymore. Not the difficult one, not the dramatic one, but the cycle breaker. The person who refused to inherit the emotional patterns that shaped the family before her. The person who chose truth over silence. The person who chose courage over cowardice. Awareness over denial. Boundaries over control. And if you were the daughter in your family who noticed the pattern, who asked the questions, who eventually stepped outside, the emotional system that raised you, I want to say this clearly. You were never the problem. You were the disruption. The moment the pattern stopped repeating without question, that is when the whole system changes. And while that role can feel lonely at times, it is also one of the most courageous positions a human being can occupy, because it means the story changes with you. The pattern ends with you. And the generations that come after you inherit something completely different. Not silence, not manipulation, not threats, not cruelty, not escapism, but awareness. And that is how cycles finally break. I am Kat Grace. If this resonates, hit that subscribe button and like and comment. Let me know what it was like for you growing up in a family with a narcissistic parent. And how did you break free? Thank you again. Namaste.